Is here now. Welcome, all of you in the audience. I'm glad you joined us today. This is not your typical radio talk show. First of all, we only discuss biblical subjects. And second, you in the audience will see all of the panelists. And let me introduce you to Jeff Smeltzer. Jeff?
Hello, Drew, and everybody who's watching today.
We're glad you're here, Jeff. Jeff is broadcasting from Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And Exton, Pennsylvania. Scott normally broadcasts from, this is live, so we're going to do these things. Scott, you're down not in Gettysburg today. Where are you at, Scott?
I'm in Prattville, Alabama.
Glad to have you here, all the way from Prattville, Alabama. And Stephen is broadcasting live from Gettysburg.
Yes, greetings, everybody. Welcome.
Glad you're here. And then myself, I'm Drew DeGrotto, broadcasting from Holmesdale, Pennsylvania. Let me first take you through some quick housekeeping, and then we'll get right into the program. If you're watching via YouTube or Facebook, you don't have the call-in live access to ask us questions. If you want to ask us questions, go through the app. You do that by going to BibleQuest.org, click Watch Live, come in, and you'll be in. And you'll be able to ask questions, and you'll see a question and answer button at the very top. Click on that button, and it'll open up the question box and leave it open, and you can just type away any questions you want. You'll also see whatever panelist is speaking. His video will be there in one of the smaller boxes on the right, depending on the computer's set up. There is a chat box, but we turn chat box off on the app, the Zoom app, because it's hard for us to manage and monitor everybody. But I do want to monitor your questions from the app, the question and answer box, and please use that box. And you can also choose to send it anonymously if you don't want to put your name in on your question. Now, keep in mind, we can't see any of you, but you can see us. Now, with all that out of the way, I want to begin today's program. Our topic today is the Sabbath. Why the Sabbath? What is the Sabbath? When did it come from? Where, and what's it all about? Does it apply to us today? And the first time we actually see the word Sabbath in the Scriptures is in Exodus 16. So I'm going to start there and then turn it over to Scott. So in Exodus 16, in verse 22, it says, and the background here is that the Lord is giving them instructions about the manna that he's going to provide them for food and how it is they're to gather it. And he says, on the sixth day they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers each. And when all the leaders of the congregation came and told Moses, he said to them, this is what the Lord has commanded. Tomorrow is a day of solemn rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake and boil what you will boil, and all that is left over lay aside to be kept till the morning. And so they laid it aside till the morning, as Moses commanded them, and it did not stink. And there were no worms in it. And Moses said, eat it today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will not find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather it, but on the seventh day, which is a Sabbath, there will be none. So with that said, Scott, you want to go ahead and give us your thoughts?
All right. Well, let's come up to then the 10 Commandments, and we have Exodus chapter 20. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shall you labor, do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, your son, daughter, male servant, female servant, livestock, or sojourner. For in 6 days the Lord made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. And then again in Deuteronomy 5, similar text to in Exodus 20, with the difference that here it says, on it you shall not do any work. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. So let's start off with some questions here. Question number 1 is what? What is the Sabbath? And it was a day to be holy, to be kept holy and rest and not work. And we've already covered that in the readings. So now we come to why. Why don't one of you gentlemen pick up right there?
Well, he gives this reason in Exodus chapter 20 that when God created everything, he did it in 6 days. And then on the seventh day, he rested, and just might make the observation That doesn't mean God was all worn out. Oh man, I've been working for 6 days. I'm tired. Need to take a nap. No, the idea here is that he ceased. You know, you might talk about a ball rolling along a table and it comes to rest, or a car, wandering through the fields without a driver and it comes to rest. And that's the idea of the word. So on the seventh day, God ceased his work of creation.
And then we have another reason in Deuteronomy, which is?
Well, that here he has them remember the fact that when they were in Egypt, they didn't have rest. They were slaves, but now they're going to get a rest.
And really, that's one of the reasons they were crying out to God for deliverance, because of the hard burdens that they were under. And keep in mind, if anybody has a question, please, as we're talking, please submit your questions. We want to hear from you. Stephen, why don't we talk now about who was told to keep the Sabbath?
Well, again, looking at that passage in Deuteronomy 5, it was specifically given to the nation of Israel. In the Old Testament, God did things a bit differently than he does in the New Testament. He had chosen a specific people through Abraham. And when the law of Moses is given, this is true of the Sabbath. This is also true of all those other commands about the sacrifices and worshiping in Jerusalem and all those things, is that it's given to this nation, this physical nation of people, the Israelite nation.
And so this so far should be pretty clear and pretty simple. The Pharisees kind of complicated it with their misperception of things. They sometimes made it more of a burden than a day of rest. And Jesus is going to say, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. But a lot of the confusion today comes from this question.
Yeah.
So which day is the Sabbath?
Yeah, you have so many people who think that they go to church on Sunday on the Sabbath. They think of this as Sunday as the Sabbath day.
Yeah, and sometimes you'll see that referenced in movies as well. One of my favorite movies is Chariots of Fire, running movie.
Yeah.
But one of the quotes from that movie is, the Sabbath's not a day for playing football, is it, lad?
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
You did that accent quite well.
That was very good.
But in the movie, it's presented that it's talking about Sunday, the day of worship, but then he refers to it as the Sabbath, and that he shouldn't be playing football or soccer on the Sabbath day. And so there's that misconception that's spread a good bit, sometimes in movies and things like that.
And for what it's worth, it's interesting that in the New Testament, when we talk about Christians worshiping, when the disciples came together on what our translation says the first day of the week, we conflate that with the Sabbath, but the language of the New Testament actually makes a very clear distinction between that day and the Sabbath day. Literally, what it's saying is the first day from the Sabbath. So there was the Jewish Sabbath on the seventh day, and then the first day thereafter, the disciples, the Christians, would come together.
Yeah. And so you see in the Old Testament, Deuteronomy 5, again, 6 days shalt thou labor, but it is the seventh that is a Sabbath. In it you shall not do any work, you, nor your son, your daughter, nor your maidservant. God rested on the seventh day. And we see that continued in the New Testament. And this question is Sunday the Sabbath. I think it's Matthew 28. I don't know if this is on your next slide. Yeah. So Matthew 28, I don't know if it gets any clearer than these passages in the New Testament in distinguishing the Sabbath from Sunday. Matthew 28:1. Now, after the Sabbath, as the first day of the week began to dawn, and it's talking about the resurrection of Jesus. Mark 16, same thing. Now, when the Sabbath was past, very early on the first day of the week, that's when the women come to the tomb. And Luke 23 into 24, on the Sabbath they rested according to the commandment, but on the first day of the week at early dawn they came unto the tomb.
And just to kind of reiterate, in each of those passages where you have the expression first day of the week, it's the first day from the Sabbath. So after the Sabbath, on the first day from the Sabbath, Jesus is raised from the dead.
Hey, Jeff, it sounds like you're mentioning that it's not, you're talking about this at another time, about the week.
Yeah.
Day of the week, and that we think of it today that the week has 7 days and we live by it across the whole globe.
Right.
Weren't you saying something about that wasn't the case then?
Yeah, so when we have those words week in our translations, we get the idea that idea of a 7-day week was already a worldwide conception, but it really wasn't. Our week comes from the Jewish law, the Old Testament law, designating a seventh-day Sabbath. And so the Jews divided up their time, their calendar, into periods of 7 days, and they counted, so many days from the Sabbath day. And they had the concept of a week in a sense. They used the word Sabbath both for the seventh day and then for the 7-day cycle, so that in Luke 18, you have the Pharisee saying, I fast twice of a Sabbath. And he's talking about 2 times in a Sabbath cycle, you might say, or in a week. But the rest of the world didn't have that concept of a 7-day week. And so really, that's the influence of Christianity that gives us that concept.
Yeah, that was really fascinating to me when we were talking about that this morning in our pre-show prep. I hadn't realized we kind of take the week for granted, but that kind of arose out of these laws that God gave to Israel as a nation. Mm-hmm. And even when he gave those laws, starting in Exodus 16, like we were talking about this morning, he has to kind of explain, okay, on this counts 6 days, and then on the 7th one, every 7, you're going to rest. And that was the concept of the Sabbath, and that's kind of worked its way into our concept of the week now.
Mm-hmm.
So somebody listening might be thinking, well, you guys have shown that Sunday is not the Sabbath. You showed that was clear in the scriptures there, and you've shown that they were commanded to keep the Sabbath. So should Christians today, should we be keeping the Sabbath? Should Saturday be a day of worship for us today? So what about that? Are Christians commanded to keep the Sabbath?
Well, where do you want to start? I mean, Paul talks about the Sabbath in Colossians chapter 2 as being among those things we're no longer to judge one another, like we don't judge one another in meat or drink according to the old dietary rules of the law of Moses. Similarly, we don't judge one another based on the Sabbath. And he's talking about the seventh-day Sabbath there.
Jeff, let me bounce this back to you. The first time we read about the word Sabbath was in Exodus as we read it. Moses wrote Exodus, right? There's no mention of the Sabbath or the celebration of the Sabbath prior to Moses. And we're talking what, thousands of years from the time when the Lord did rest on the seventh day. And so sometimes I've heard it say that, well, because the Lord did that, he instituted the Sabbath celebration or the Sabbath holiness of the day from then, and that man is to worship him on that day exclusively.
Yeah. The Sabbath concept is not just kind of an arbitrary little thing that God just stuck in for a period of time during the law of Moses. But Scott, I think you're going to talk about how really this Sabbath law that he gave the Jews was part of an overall plan that God has in mind, not necessarily keeping the seventh day observance, but the idea of a rest that God's people have.
Yeah, I'm having a little trouble here getting this screen up, but there it is. Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, on this here we see this passage that Jeff mentioned a few moments ago. It should be there. Yeah, Colossians 2. Paul has just talked about how the ordinances of the old covenant had been nailed to the cross. And then he draws this conclusion, Colossians 2. Therefore, as Jeff read a few minutes ago, let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food. For instance, can we eat pork today? Yes. Or a Sabbath. These are a shadow of the things to come. And that idea of shadow, just watch it as we see this here. We had in the beginning, God created the world, life, everything. And then what did he do? He rested. Then, as Drew read to us, they collect the manna, and then they are to rest. In the 10 Commandments, they are to work 6 days and then rest. And then they're leaving this land of slavery and going into a land of rest. Psalm 95 talks about that the Lord swore in his wrath for that first generation that was rebellious, you won't enter into my rest. And then when Jesus comes, beautiful passage in Matthew 11, he says, come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and what? I will give you
rest.
There's a song, I really like this one line in the song. It says, O ye that are weary of sin. And it's a lot of pain and anxiety and trouble in life in sin. and Jesus is offering us a way out. He says, I will give you rest. And then you have what in Revelation chapter 14, verse 11. Here it's talking about the faithful and the unfaithful. And it says in verse 11 of the unfaithful, they have no rest day and night. And yet we have in verse 14, no, not verse 14, excuse me, verse 13. I've got the wrong verse there, people, sorry. Verse 13, I heard a voice from heaven saying, right, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from henceforth. Yea, says the Spirit, they may rest from their labors.
So all these ideas are interrelated. God, from the very beginning, had a plan in mind of giving his people a rest, a cessation from their toil with sin. And he first of all illustrates that in the creation. He encodes it into the law of Moses in the weekly Sabbath day that the Jews observed. The idea of the Israelites marching through the wilderness on the way to a rest that they would arrive at. And then, of course, the rest that we have ultimately in Jesus. God, you did some work years ago on Hebrews chapter 4, where in Hebrews chapter 3, the writer goes back and talks about the Israelites who didn't make it to their rest because of their unbelief. And then the writer in chapter 4 says, there's still a rest for us.
Yes.
And it's clear that Old Testament promised land rest for the Israelites foreshadows the rest for us. He says, let's learn the lesson. Let's not make the mistake they did, lest we don't enter into our rest.
Right.
Let me just ask for new people that came in the audience, just open up your question and answer box by clicking the little button at the top, Q&A, and then type in your questions, and we'll get to your questions during the show.
And sometimes I think as we're talking about this principle, because we see it from the beginning, some people think, oh, well, they were observing the Sabbath through all these years until it's made part of the law of Moses, and then it's true for the law of Moses, but now we should continue today. I think it's just interesting to think about and remember that, like Scott, you just mentioned in this picture of rest, is they were given this day that they weren't to work. And that's being given at a time when they've spent the last 400 years in slavery. I don't think the Egyptians gave them
not a lot of rest there. That's right.
Yeah.
And so there's this picture of deliverance. There's this picture of rest, and that was not something they had been observing up to that point. They couldn't have.
Yeah.
Now they've been given this deliverance, and that was to continue for their nation.
And I think you may have just mentioned it, but it's in Deuteronomy 5 where the Ten Commandments are reiterated, and it talks about keeping the Sabbath. It reminds them that they were slaves in Egypt, so now they're going to get a rest. The thought just occurs to me. We no more need to keep the seventh day rest of the Old Testament than we need to go to the promised land, the land of Canaan over there in the Middle East to get a rest.
Right.
Both of those things were foreshadowing the rest that is ultimately for God's people in Jesus in eternity.
And the Hebrew author in Hebrews 4, he's pointing out that Psalm 95, where it said, I said to your fathers that they will not enter into my rest. That's written by, David hundreds of years later. When that's written, they've been in the land for a long time, and yet there's still this warning, don't be like them that didn't get to go into the rest. And some people will look at Hebrews 4 and trying to say we should still be in the Sabbath today. They'll say, it says right there remains a Sabbath. The point here is not what you have remains. The point here was there's something that remains to be had.
Yeah.
This great eternal rest down there.
Yeah. Exactly.
It sounds like to me, guys, what you guys are saying is that there's more emphasis on the rest part of this concept Sabbath than it is on a particular day to do something. Now,
the Sabbath was extremely important, but it was, as Colossians 2 said, a shadow of the things to come. It's part of this bigger picture.
I may get into the weeds a little bit here, and anybody feel free to tell me to be quiet if you think I'm getting in the weeds too much here. But
okay.
Have you ever heard anybody argue in Colossians 2 when we cite this passage that you've got on screen here? They say, well, that's not talking about the seventh day Sabbath because it's plural, and there are a lot of Sabbath days in the Old Testament, and some of those are like the seventh year is a Sabbath, and that sort of thing. The Day of Atonement is a Sabbath, and so they're saying that Paul only means that the part of the law that no longer is applicable to everybody, not that it ever was, but what's not binding today, they say, is just those other Sabbaths, but the seventh-day Sabbath is still required. Have you heard people make that argument?
Oh, yes, yes.
So the thing that is interesting to me is in the Old Testament, there are 4 or 5 places where there's kind of a list of the different liturgies or the different holy days in order, either from most frequent to least frequent or least frequent to most frequent. So in 1 Chronicles 23 and verse 31, it mentions the burnt offerings daily, the Sabbaths weekly, the new moons monthly, and the fixed festivals which are yearly. And then you come to 2 Chronicles chapter 2 and verse 4, and it mentions the burnt offerings morning and evening, that's daily, the Sabbaths, that's weekly, the new moons, that's monthly, and the appointed feasts, that's yearly. And then you come to 2 Chronicles chapter 8 and verse 13, and it mentions the Sabbaths, that's daily, the new moons, that's monthly, and the 3 annual feasts, and that's yearly. And then you come to 2 Chronicles chapter 31 and verse 3. It mentions the morning and evening burnt offerings, and that's daily, and the Sabbaths, that's weekly, and the new moons, that's monthly, and the fixed festivals, and that's yearly. And there's also a passage in Nehemiah chapter 10, and I believe it's verse 33 does the same thing. Now, we go to Colossians chapter 2, and you've got kind of the abridged version of the passage, so I'm going to turn in my Bible to it. And in Colossians chapter 2 and verse 16, listen to it. Let no man therefore judge you in meat or in drink or in respect of a feast day, there'd be your annual, or a new moon, there would be your monthly, or a Sabbath day, that's your weekly. So he does the same kind of thing that we see in the Old Testament. I think it makes it clear. He's not talking about the 7-year Sabbath or the once-a-year Sabbath or anything. He's talking about the weekly Sabbath.
Yeah. I think another thing is we just think about that is he doesn't go into all the details there. I think you've made a powerful argument for why this is that way, that they were mentioned in that way in the Old Testament. But it's interesting to me sometimes the confusion that often happens between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And I see lots of people clamoring to hold on to the Sabbath day. I think we see lots of people clamoring to hold on to instrumental music. Maybe it's something we can talk about in another study sometime. But I don't see a lot of people clamoring for animal sacrifices or some of the other ritualistic things of the Old Testament. And it's the kind of thing that when we have, I think, a proper understanding of the Old Testament and the New Testament, the old law, the law of Moses was given just for the nation of the Jews, that it all kind of, it's a package deal. It all kind of goes together. And if we're going to fight, oh no, we have to keep the Sabbath. Well, what about all these other things that the law says? Are we wanting to keep all those as well? And it all kind of, it's a package deal.
Now, let me throw out a question here, and you guys tell me what you think. So in the Old Testament, one thing's about the Sabbath, it, like the Levitical, like the priesthood and like circumcision, is spoken of as being an eternal covenant forever, that kind of thing. Would you say there's a sense in which it is in as much as it is pointing to the ultimate Sabbath of God, kind of like circumcision is pointing to the circumcision of the heart? Or would you deal with that some other way?
No, I think you're making a very good analogy there.
What do you think?
The whole thing is about the ultimate rest, i.e. heaven.
Yeah.
Stephen, Scott, what are your thoughts?
I'm stuck trying to get the charts fixed. I thought I was off screen, but I was. And so I'm in recovery mode a little bit.
All right.
Trying to get something back up.
No, I think that's the right idea, Jeff, is there's 2 extremes of thought on the old law. The one is that, well, we have to keep it. We have to do all these different things, or we have to keep parts of it at least and try to figure out which parts. And the other is we just discard it. We don't learn the lessons from it. But God was teaching his people things about himself and the way that he works.
Yeah.
And like we've already mentioned, some of those things were rooted in things that predated the law, like creation and those things, the liberation from slavery and all of that. And so I do think there's a lot of lessons we can learn from the Sabbath day. One, of course, as we've already mentioned, is the looking forward, the hope that the Christian should have of this rest. That we're tired now, we're hurting now, there's problems of sin and decay and the curse and everything. we're looking forward to freedom from those things.
And that should really give us a hope. The idea, we know that we struggle with temptation, we struggle with sin in this life, and we need to fight that battle, and we need to bring every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ. But it's a struggle, but we are going to be, as Paul says in Galatians 1:4, delivered out of this present evil world and arrive at a destination where we can cease from that struggle.
Yeah, that power, I think that's really powerful because we just get so tired sometimes, life wears us down, and it's easy sometimes, even people, myself at sometimes, or others that I've talked with, you're just kind of ready to just give it a rest. And
no pun intended.
yeah, well, and I just think it's a beautiful thing that we have that reminder. One other practical application, though, I think even just for now, as we've already established, the Christian is not to keep the Sabbath day in the same way they were. You can work on a Saturday. That's an okay thing. But there is a principle there of just taking time out from your work, taking time out from the constant busyness of our daily lives to worship God and to focus and to rest. And God wants us not to just be so frantic in every area of our life that we just never slow down to think about Him and to take that time for even our families as well, just to focus on those really important things that sometimes our busy lives just is too much noise. We can't focus on God. So that Sabbath principle, I think, is still applicable in that way for us.
That's why I call it the noise of life, right?
Let's hit this real quickly here because we're coming up on toward the end of the program. And if somebody's thinking, well, then, okay, so it's not Saturday, it's Sunday, but Sunday's not the Sabbath. When we look at the New Testament, what do we see about the first day of the week? In the first place, it's interesting. You cannot find in the New Testament the expression second day of the week, third day of the week, fourth day of the week, but you have first day of the week used a lot. And of course, it's primarily first in every gospel ends with what? The empty tomb being found on the first day of the week.
After
the day Jesus appears to the apostles on 2 first days of the week. And then you have in Acts 2, it's the day of Pentecost, which if you go back to the Old Testament, you find out it was a day after a certain Sabbath, the next day. So it would have been a Sunday. 1 Corinthians 16, what day did Paul tell the Christians there at Corinth to lay by in store for the needy saints? On the first day of the week. Acts 20, verse 7, when did they gather for the Lord's Supper? On the first day of the week. In Revelation 1:10, the Lord's Day. Mm-hmm. Now, none of these say that you couldn't do any work. For instance, in Acts 20, they were meeting at night, probably because a lot of the people, slaves and other people, were at work.
Right.
So people, they're not doing this because this is a day their animals can't do any labor. They're doing this because this is the day Jesus rose from the dead.
Right.
Yeah, which is a reminder of our deliverance. I mean, that's the day that the power of death was broken, and Jesus rises from the dead. And like the Israelites were released from slavery, we're released from our slavery to sin, figuratively speaking, in the resurrection of Jesus, his triumph of sin and death. And so in that sense, Christians come together on the first day of the week, celebrating our deliverance, and similar principle, the way they celebrated their deliverance on Saturday.
Yeah.
Good point. Very good point.
We have
about a minute left. We had no questions from the audience, which I find unusual. Last week we had quite a few. There's still time. Put a question. No one else will see your question, and just type it in that Q&A box and comment or question.
Let's mention real quickly. We had something about Luke chapter 17 last week that we noticed a question came in or a comment or something right at the end of the program, and we were going to try to get back to that this week, but we weren't sure what the question pertained to in Luke chapter 17. So if whoever submitted that is watching and you want to resubmit that, we can try to get to that next week.
Yeah, we did look at it, trying to anticipate what that question was, but it wasn't clear. It just was a reference to that. Did we consider Luke 17? So yeah, if you're in the audience and you asked that question last week, ask it again a little bit more clear, and we'll get to it next week. Scott, what is the topic for next week? Did we actually lock that down yet?
Oh, that's right. Yes, we did. We're going to be talking about Romans 1. I went brain dead there for a minute. And what's our problem? and Romans 1 is going to tell us about it.
Yeah, what's
You
our
might look at us right now and say, I have some other problems too. But next week we'll be talking about the problem that we have that's outlined in Romans chapter 1.
Right, man's state of affairs. What is our problem? Okay. So we just coming up to 2:30. We really want to I want to thank you guys for your input on all of this. And
I think I looked good today.
Better than usual.
Yeah, this is the best I've looked.
Yeah, Scott, you do look good today.
Yeah,
and I apologize. I didn't mention that why we're not seeing.
Black screen and white letters, a lot cleaner.
Yeah, well, the reason we don't see Scott is because he's broadcasting from down in Alabama. He's down there preaching on a gospel meeting down there, right, Scott?
Yeah, and I didn't bring my camera with me, so.
And you didn't bring your camera to put onto your laptop, so that's okay. We'll let it go. But we did hear you. We saw your slides. Well, I think we can wrap it up for today, gentlemen. Any other thoughts or questions?
See you next week.
Yeah, thanks to everybody.
Looking forward to it. Everybody in the audience, thank you for joining us. I hope you come back again next week at 2 p.m. And please share this link, BibleQuest.org, with your friends and help us to grow the audience and get more information and more feedback. I really appreciate it. Thank you to everyone. Enjoy the rest of the week. Bye-bye.